We're talking about two issues which are distinct and linked, cybersecurity and space. Both talk about leadership in the future. Here it is. Now, I'm going to say a word or two about the two panelists, and after that, I'm going to ask them to comment. Usually you come to a panel with a few key thoughts you want to make sure you impart, and I'm going to give them the chance to do that right off the bat. Summarize what your thoughts are in approaching this panel. You have the biographies. Sarah Mineiro is at the Center for New American Security and Senior Director for Space Strategy at Anduril Industries. Now, she started her career as an intelligence analyst, as a lot of you will be one day, for the National Air and Space Intelligence Center in Dayton, Ohio. She worked for the Undersecretary of the Air Force for International Affairs and the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Now, that's all very interesting, but probably her most brutal direct combat experience came from the time she spent on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee in the dangerous halls of Congress. Currently, she serves on the Defense Innovation Board Space Advisory Committee, on the Board of Directors for the United States Space Force Association. What I love about her bio is it shows she's both human and has a sense of humor. She's a mom, she paints, she reads comic books, and she plucks a guitar. Lieutenant General Bruce Crawford, retired, is a South Carolina native. He is the Senior Vice President for Strategic Development and Critical Mission Solutions at Jacobs. And in South Carolina, he entered the Army through the ROTC program at the South Carolina State University, and he rose to be the Army's Chief Information Officer and Senior IT official. He was Principal IT and Cybersecurity Policy Advisor to the Secretary of the Army and the Army Chief of Staff. 34 years of service here. General Crawford had a variety of operational and strategic positions in Europe, the Pacific, and Southwest Asia. Now, for the cadets, in addition to his honors and recognitions, he is authorized to wear the badge of the Army Combat Action Badge, the Master Parachutist Badge, the Ranger Tab, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Army Staff Identification Badge. There's more in the program, but let's get on to hear from our panelists. Sarah, let's just start with you. How would you kick us off this morning? What are your thoughts as we get started?
I have so many thoughts, but let's try to stick to the panel. So space is a fascinating domain. I am a bit of a pariah in the space community because I love to talk not only about kind of the defense applications, the establishment of the Space Force, what that looks like, how space contributes to the national security enterprise, but I also wholly embrace just being a space nerd. I wholly embrace the fact that space is inspirational. It's inspirational not only to the men and women in uniform, but also to the rest of civil society. And it's increasingly seen as foundational for the economy and for the civil society that we live in. And so, I've spent my entire career in DoD space and IC space, the intelligence community space. I think what you're going to start to see in the next, 5, 10, 15 years, what you've started to see with the trend with things like Starlink, with the rise of SpaceX, with the rise of the VC-backed kind of space startups that you're starting to see out there, is you're going to really see this erosion between what were previously pretty stovepiped perspectives on space. So there was a national security, there was a Department of Defense space. There was an intelligence community, space community. There was a NASA civil space community. There was a commercial space community. And I think what you're starting to see is those stovepipes becoming less apparent. And I think that is for the betterment of the entire space enterprise. It's about a $350 to $450 billion space economy with an annual growth that's pretty staggering. And I think that's for the benefit of our national security apparatus and speaks well for our competition in the future. I think at the same time, this is an area where there's still a lot of legitimate and robust debate. about the viability of a lot of these young space startups, about how they contribute to national security space, and kind of figuring out what the role is for the Space Force as it is, quite frankly, less than a couple years old. And people are frequently coming to me and saying, is the Space Force doing everything you thought it would do when you wrote the language in Congress? And I'm like, that's a totally unfair question because it's only 2 years old, guys, so let's just take a deep breath. Let's make sure that they're getting, they're taking the right steps in the right direction, and I think they are, and they've got fantastic leadership there. But our continued superiority and dominance in space is not assured, and making sure that we recognize that is going to be foundational for success in the future.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. General Crawford, what are your thoughts as we get started?
Well, Art, thank you. First of all, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for the invitation. This is my first visit to the great state of Connecticut, and have taken such good care of us since we've been here. So a couple of thoughts. I appreciate the warm introduction, but the thing that's most important and really, really cool and interesting is I'm a grandfather now twice in the last 24 months. So,
yeah.
So that's the thing that keeps me busy. So if anybody out there is in that business and you got any hot tips for me, go ahead and let me know, all right? Because my wife and I are newbies. So a couple of thoughts. Lots of discussion about the era of great power competition, and that's enduring. But when I think you start to wrap your mind around the key aspects of the great era of great power competition, there's kind of a couple of things that bubble to the top. So absolutely, cybersecurity is important, but you got to think about why cybersecurity is important. Think about where the next fight, and you could argue while we're literally sitting here, the current fight is actually occurring. It's occurring below the level of what we would consider to be armed conflict. All right, and so absolutely things like technology are important. There's a lot of work to be done there. Absolutely, we got to continue. So we're going to have a conversation up here about people. All right, but the real value of cybersecurity, it is going to be a part of our competitive advantage in being able to fight and win below the level of armed conflict. And so as you start to look at the way forward, lots of exciting things, laws, organizations that have been formed, very similar to what Sarah said. Had an opportunity to meet a new National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, last week, and have an opportunity right before he testified, probably about an hour and a half before, hear him speak. A couple of things came through. Unity of effort. All right, get used to hearing about unity of effort across the entire ecosystem that is cybersecurity. The other thing I'll tell you is get used to hearing about the resiliency of the entire ecosystem, vice one particular piece. In this business, a vulnerability accepted by one, especially given the fact that 3.7 billion people in this world are not connected, half the world's population. And coming out of COVID, there's almost a mandate to connect those 3.7 billion people. Get used to unity of effort in making all that happen. And the last thing I just wanted to say, and I wanted to close with a quote. So I'm old, so I had to write this down. But it comes out of the National Defense Strategy. I think it's on page 11 if you take a look at it. But talks about collaboration and innovation, and it really gets after this big idea of what's really going to be required is unity of effort. And it says, and I quote, "Success no longer goes to the country that develops a new technology first, but rather the one that better integrates it and adapts its way of fighting," unquote. And so look forward to the questions, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, we're really glad you're here. Now, I've got some questions, and I hope you do as well, and they're not going to be either space or cyber. They're going to be both. And so the first one, I'll ask you, General, to pick up on something you just said, which is where do you get the talent? Where do you get the brain power for all this? Both cyber and space represent a competition for talent, or race for it. And how do you recruit the talent that we need? And are the speed and scale of American education adequate to fill these needs?
Yeah, I'll start with the second one first, speed and scale. I believe we're teaching the right things. All right, as we go across, and I spend a lot of time talking to universities, large and small, speaking with high schools, talking to junior ROTC cadets, talking to parents, counselors, everybody's interested in science, technology, engineering, and math, to include STEAM, which adds the arts in there. I think, so we're teaching the right things, but I think we've got to take a step back and reimagine the workforce of the future. And so a couple things associated with that. One, I think we got to really give some thought to what really motivates and inspires this next greatest generation of leaders. My generation was motivated and inspired beyond patriotism and the need, a desire to serve. We were motivated and inspired by different things. Things like work-life balance, okay? Things like meaningful work, meaning I don't care if I'm the junior employee in the company, I want to make sure that my voice is heard. And so we are teaching the right things, but I think we've got to take a step back and reimagine what really inspires and motivates that workforce of the future so that when we get them, we're able to keep them on our team. The last point on that, how we're doing it, all right? So it is very unlikely that we're going to get the talent we're looking for to sit in an auditorium and listen to a lecture, for an hour and a half or 2 hours, a week on a regular basis to kind of gain what they're looking for and what they need and what we need them to be doing. And so we've really, especially coming out of the pandemic in the last 18 months on this, we've got to take a look at some of these companies that have got innovative, game-changing ideas to, rather than producing, 40-year degrees, and I'm really a big fan of that, but what about nano degrees? What about the fact that we need to pivot from a focus on certifications to a focus on skills? So it's a multifaceted problem, but I think reimagining the workforce of the future and really understanding what inspires them, what motivates them, is a key piece of this. And then taking a look at how it is we get to speed and scale. And a way to get to speed and scale is not the traditional route, but perhaps online training, which gives them the time to do some of the other things in their lives that they like to do, and recognizing the fact that not everybody needs to be a PhD, all right, in a particular area, and perhaps we need to really focus on the skill and not just a certification, which is the way we kind of think about the problem set today.
Thank you. Sarah, this talent, are we getting it? Are we training it adequately? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I love this emphasis on skills, on thinking about micro certifications or nano kinds of degrees. The space community is fascinating because we all have something in common. We're all nerds, right? Like nobody goes into the space community as like, oh, I'm the coolest space nerd. Like you can say that, but you're the coolest space nerd. Like let's get a grip, right? And so at the end of the day, we are all thinking about something that is inherently bigger than an individual, bigger than, in some cases, the sector, the country, and the planet, right? And that is what, I've never met a space nerd who wasn't into space nerdy things, right? Because that you're self-selecting in that group. In one of the interesting kinds of articles that I wrote and that I got a lot of flack from my community on was this perspective on diversity and inclusion in the Space Force. So the Space Force actually has a diversity and inclusion officer at the headquarters level, and I applaud them for that, and they've actually done some really fantastic work there, integrating stuff and recommendations that Secretary Esper actually brought forward. And there's tremendous baseline work that has been done there. I think, when you look at who the space operators are and who the self-selecting community of space nerds are that will go into the Space Force, we look at diversity and inclusion not only at a demographic level of age, race, creed, but also fundamentally at an interspecies level, right? Like people who are into space as a domain or space as an interest should have a pretty wide view of diversity and inclusion, because it's not just about, the fundamental communication of, can we talk to each other, but it's literally how you communicate across, different species, right? It is literally ingrained into what makes you a space nerd. And so that talent, I think, and that looking for people who really value diversity not only in what is kind of characterized and classified in the law as diversity being a requirement, but also the intellectual diversity, the diversity of experience, the diversity of background, the diversity that can pull somebody from South Carolina and bring them up to be a 3-star. That's fantastic. The diversity of, I'm adopted. I was born in an orphanage in South Korea. I was adopted by a Polish Jew and an Irish Catholic with a Jewish father who married a black woman. That is the most amazing American story
cool.
ever. Yeah, no, we have very politically incorrect family reunions, and they're amazing, and they're totally American. It's the opportunity to do that I think is really fantastic, and that cherishing that entire range of diversity and inclusion, I think is something that this next generation will gravitate towards and value, and I think it's something that should be celebrated in all of the services.
Yeah, thank you for telling us that about yourself. I mean, it draws forth in a very personal way exactly the message that you were talking about, your personal example. I'd like to talk about leadership for a second. There's a book that's just come out by an Annapolis graduate, Rear Admiral David Oliver, who distinguishes between leadership and management. And he points out that management is what most of the time we focus on, and sometimes we call it leadership. But management is accepting responsibility, producing results, doing what you're supposed to do, being competent, being accountable, and all that. Leadership necessarily involves taking risks. A leader not only manages, but also looks to what needs to be done, what should be done, accepts those risks and the consequences of them. So a question about leadership. Now, once you've got this talent that we've talked about here, what's your advice for leadership to the space guardians, the cyber warriors, and everyone who will be accepting these challenges these men and women face? How, when they go into the fields of cyber and space, how will they become effective leaders? And let's start back with you, Sarah.
Yeah. So I'm very honest with people that, my path is probably not the path for everybody, and my approach is not the approach for everybody. I'm very kind of in your face with a lot of things. I wear a lot of, what I think on my sleeve. I will tell you, for me, it's a matter of integrity, of doing the right thing when nobody's watching. It's a matter of authenticity. I've been in a lot of situations where there is either external or implied expectations of how I should look or how I should act or how I should think. And at the end of the day, what I tell myself is I am the only person that has to look back in that mirror and be okay with what I see. And that has cost me, perhaps personally and professionally, but I'm happy with who I see. And that takes a lot of moral courage to make the right choice in the face of things that may not always be right. Art talked about my combat experience on the Hill. It was not combat experience, but man, there was some tough stuff up on the Hill. But making sure that is making sure you're comfortable with who you are, and celebrating your whole personhood outside of what you do from your 9 to 5. And all of that is a journey and that you take with every step that you make, right? I mean, if there's one, I had a chance actually to go back to the orphanage that I was born in South Korea. And it kept on trying to push a baby on me. I was like, I'm not walking out of here with a baby, but thank you. It's kind. I would have been a terrible mother back then. But, it's about recognizing and celebrating who you are as an entire person. And if you do that well, and you do that genuinely, you can be a leader at any level in your organization. And quite frankly, perhaps the most important to kind of mid-career, young and mid-career, are those informal leadership positions and opportunities that you seize with your peers and your direct reports.
Thank you. General leadership in the cyber and space communities, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know that it's going to be any different in the cyber and space communities. I think because they're all very complex and they're all constantly changing. If I had to offer any advice, just a couple of things. I'd say one, have a passion all right? If you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's unlikely you're going to be very, very good at it, regardless of what that happens to be. We've all got a variety of different passions. We're all, interested in different things. But if I could give you, I'd say the first piece of advice would be to have a passion. All right. The second thing is a little bit more nuanced, but I found to be very helpful and informative for me. Is so at some point you're going to start supervising people. All right. Because you're going to get there, you're going to do very well, you're going to crush it, okay? But then they're going to give you people to supervise. And then you're going to get to pick people. And I'd say probably one of the greatest attributes of leaders that I've admired is their ability to pick the right people at the right time. And so in picking those people, and again, this is a little bit more nuanced than some of the other things, because I had one more point to make, but make sure you surround yourself with people and be willing to surround yourself with people who think differently than you do, who don't come from where you are from. I mean, I'm the world's biggest Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and I used to, you don't want people. I know this is a bad place to be talking about my Steelers, but you want to make sure, and there's a couple of reasons for that, surrounding yourself with people who think differently. But I've done it throughout my career, especially the 9 years or so that I was a general officer. I wanted somebody on my team who was willing to raise their hand and felt empowered to raise their hand when I just came up with yet another bad idea, probably the worst one they had heard. And so it might not mean a lot to you right now, all right? But as you progress, regardless of what you decide to go into, don't be afraid to pick people who are just kind of to completely different personality, completely different background than you. And then the last thing I'll tell you is character. Regardless of what you do, you're going to be asking people to do things. In some cases, it'll be dangerous things. And if they don't trust you, all right, you could be handing out free money, all right, and they're not going to follow you, all right? And so do everything that you can to always be a person of high character in whatever it is, whatever direction that life takes you. So that's the advice. And again, these are not unique to a technical field, or not unique to space, or unique to cyber. These are some of the fundamental things that I think you're going to need in your kit bag, whether you grow up to be the Secretary of Defense or you go out and discover the next iPad or iPhone and become a billionaire. These are just some of the fundamentals that I highly recommend that you at least consider and give some thought to.
Thank you, General. Megan, I got a lot of great questions, and they're doing fine here. Suppose the audience wants to weigh in. Do they have mics?
Yes, they do. And I actually, when you're ready, Art, have a few questions from Zoom. So whenever you're ready.
All right, go ahead. Give us a Zoom question just for kicks. Let's see what's going on in Zoom land.
Yeah. This has got to make sure. I think it's this. Oh, it's this mic. So here's a question from Mary Beth F. on Zoom, and it's for Sarah. Is anything comparable to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty being worked on today?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you for this question. This is actually a really fascinating question. So the Outer Space Treaty that is being referred to is still in place. I think there's been a lot of commentary about how the space domain has fundamentally outgrown it. I will tell you that there is not international consensus that either an update to the Outer Space Treaty or another legally binding international treaty, there's not international consensus that that's going to happen. What there is relative consensus on right now is the need for rules of the road or responsible behavior, norms of technical norms that, quite frankly, have to do with things like debris mitigation, like how long, right, is space junk going to be up there? What are you going to do with the space junk? Can you deorbit that space junk? Right, what does the sustainability of the space environment look like? And so there's a lot of, quite frankly, commercially driven technical norms that are voluntary because they're best practices for the sustainability of the operational domain that are probably going to be pursued and have been brought up in international forum like the United Nations Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is legitimately like a a committee. It's based in Vienna. It's next to the IAEA. And I've been a part of that delegation. It is also the body where you would have that kind of an international treaty first postulated, and quite frankly, it is a place where you see very clear distinctions between how the U.S. approaches fostering cooperation in that domain versus Russia and China. And there are very clear competition for who has the loudest voice and who has the most robust alliances in that context.
General, did you want to add to that?
No, not on the treaty. I'll leave that one alone.
Okay, all right, that's fine. I've got a joint question. One of my favorite admirals was Dennis Blair, whom I know quite well. And when Nichols Goldwater came down, he was, I think, a lieutenant commander, and he said, "This is ridiculous. The obvious answer to this is to try to bring the other branches of the armed services up to the level of excellence that the Navy already has. And if we can get that done," well, he gave that up. He served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and later was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific. So joint is here, despite the pride that all of you have in your own service right now. So this is a question about how cyber and space fit into the Joint Command. Cyber and space affect, obviously, all the military branches. So what are the joint all-domain ramifications of these new commands? How do you grow as integrated, embedded forces? And is the Defense Department doing all that it should in these areas? General, let's start with you.
Yeah, actually, it's pretty fascinating, some of the things that the Defense Department is doing. I think Secretary Austin just signed out a concept document, if I remember correctly. It was in the March-April timeframe, maybe a little later than that, on joint all-domain command and control, which is essentially takes a look at all things related to those 5 domains that you could argue matter most. A couple things about joint all-domain command and control, and then we'll talk about the specific piece related to cyber and the forces. When you think about joint all-domain command and control, I try and simplify by saying, look, think about every sensor that we happen to own. Think about every weapon system or shooter that we happen to own, and then think about every command and control node. That's everything from a ship at sea to a soldier walking the ground to the Pentagon, that they all have near real-time access, and that there is a common data fabric that allows information to be openly shared and used, assessed throughout all those domains. The reason for that is it comes down, to one big thing, and that's the ability to orient, decide faster than peer adversaries. And so that's the concept in terms of, I'm super jazzed actually having watched it over the last 3 years go from multi-domain operations to what we're now calling CJC2, because it's combined joint all-domain operations, and the C on the front actually acknowledges the coalition piece, which is one of the priorities in our national defense strategy about ensuring our allies. And so that's I think JADC2 is going to be bigger than JADC2, because I think it's going to be a forcing function to look at all the enablers and all the adjacencies associated with those 5 domains. So that's kind of point one on things that are going on that I think are going to be game changers here in the next 36 months or so. On the jointness of the force, I think what makes cyber interesting and fascinating to me is it's almost born joint. When you take a look at the skill sets that are required, whether you're looking at the kind of broader defense network, offensive or defensive capabilities, when you look at the services categorically, of course the end game is a little bit different for each one of the services, but categorically they're kind of doing the same things. Cyber Command is a joint organization. Happens to be commanded by a good friend and Army officer, Paul Nakasone, right now. But I was, when we stood up the joint commands in the combatant command, so I happened to be the first director of the Joint Cyber Center in Europe. And so when you combine the fact that, to your question about the jointness and how it's being integrated, I think the skills are very similar and similar enough to where some of the parts could be interchangeable. B, when you look at the operational construct of the joint force, every combatant command and the fact that you've got a COCOM in and of itself of cyber command, lends itself to the jointness. I mean, they're literally constructed to be joint from birth. So I'm not really concerned about it going in a completely different direction. And I happen to know that when you look, even looking at the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and Space Force cyber component command type entities, they work very well together, all right, because they've got a common cause. And so I think we're in a good place with respect to the jointness of the cyber force.
That's encouraging. Sarah, how do your space warriors, your space guardians, fit into the world of joint?
Yeah, I think space, again, starts from a very similar place. Understanding that all of the services use space assets. All of civil society uses space assets every day. You have petabytes of data coming down that support everything from the timing signatures on your ATM transactions to GPS, both on the military side and on the civil side, right? Quite frankly, space has been seen as a support domain, supporting all of the other kind of more operational domains for the past probably, well, up until a couple of years ago, right? Like everybody said, okay, space is a support domain from which you get services that come down and actually touch operators. And I will tell you, I mean, that's a terribly joint concept because at the end of the day, quantitatively, the largest number of tactical users of space data is not actually the Air Force. It is the Army, and they do a phenomenal job, one, understanding the tactical benefits and uses of space-derived data, but also in their own kind of FA-40 community, doing a tremendous amount with the limited amount of resources that they actually have. When I worked on the Hill, I was always trying to over-resource the FA-40s, because I just thought that they did, dollar for dollar, just provided such value to the entirety of the national security enterprise. And I think it caused a lot of jealousy because the Air Force was like, well, why are you not as generous with us? And I was like, well, I think they do a better job sometimes, I don't know. I funded the Air Force a lot too. But it was a lot of fun. But, space now is really at this inflection point with being named as a warfighting domain in the past couple of years, where it's now starting to recognize that it's not just a support domain, but it is also a domain in which we can anticipate that conflict will either start or at least extend to. And so it's a really interesting point to think about how the rest of the services address that, and not only as a support domain, but a domain in which they're going to all operate. How that fits into the broader conceptualization and how all of the programmatics, quite frankly, for combined joint all-domain command and control get parsed out by the services. So the lenses by which the services approach joint all-domain command and control, whether it's ABMS for the Air Force or Project Convergence with the Army or Overmatch, right? I mean, it's every operator kind of looks at their requirements for joint all-domain command and control through their operational lens, and that's exactly how it should be. So making sure that that all gets done, and you're using the capabilities from space, from cyber, from all of your sister services is really important.
That's great. Megan, you got some paper there. Any good juicy ones from Zoom World?
I do. I have one here for General Crawford. So General
It's
Crawford.
juicy?
It's a little juicy.
Okay.
So that's a terrible word, right? So what do you see as the single largest threat in developing United States leadership in the cyber domain, maybe over the next 20 years? So what's the greatest threat? And it might be worthwhile asking Sarah what she thinks some of the big space threats are.
From a threat perspective, and I'm guessing you're talking, just given the context of the question, it's internal threat. It may be challenge.
Yeah, maybe challenge. It's from Tim in Oregon, and it's pretty early in Oregon. So
Yeah. I think the greatest challenge is that we don't have unity of effort. All right, remember, it's all about the resiliency. Not all, but a lot of it is about kind of raising the bar on the resiliency of the entire ecosystem, just given the connectedness. And I talked about the other 3 billion that we're trying to connect. And so if I had to pick kind of one thing, it's going to be that. I mean, there's a lot of accountability, and you're going to hear a lot more here, just given some of the documents that are starting to make their way out across the government. And so I would say that would be number one. If I had to pick another one, I think another big challenge is going to be public-private partnerships. All right, and it's in the Solarium report. It's been talked about. I believe it's in the POTUS Exord also. But how do we get to this? How do we get to this place where we've got trust and transparency and kind of the right degree of public-private partnerships in place? So if you're in the private sector, you may not have the intelligence that the government has. If you're in the government side, well, 90% of the critical infrastructure actually belongs to the private sector. So how do you find kind of that, I'm going to throw out this term happy space here. That's not a technical term, okay? And so I don't want anybody to write me on that. But how do you get yourself to this place on the idea of public-private partnerships where we can really raise the bar collectively for the country, and you could argue in assuring our allies also with respect to the resiliency of the entire cyber ecosystem by one particular piece of it or other. Back to this idea that the vulnerability accepted by one is the vulnerability accepted by all, and it's kind of designed to be that way. So hopefully I answered the question from Oregon.
Sarah, anything he said or that came from the question that inspired you to offer comments?
Yeah, I think for the space community and the Space Force, it's a smidge different, right? Because the Space Force is a service that's less than 2 years old at this point. There is a real opportunity in the Space Force from every single, I guess they're called guardians, from every single guardian to be able to shape the culture and the decisions of that organization as it grows up. And, this is not something that the other services have the opportunity to do. They have, very established kind of cultures and norms, and everybody kind of understands what that is. The Space Force was given a pretty blank sheet to define themselves. And the question now, and the threat internally, right, is about how those leaders and those next generation leaders are going to be able to define themselves and set themselves on a path for success that's unique to the domain, but also recognizing the jointness of what they do. And so that's the thing that I think is going to be most challenging for the Space Force is, defining their path as they walk it.
General, you alluded to the private sector, and I want to make sure I draw you out for anything else you might want to say about that, because both of these areas depend extremely heavily on the private sector, and the American private sector in both cyber and space is not only global leading, but absolutely critical to what we do. And there's a special relationship between both space and cyber and the private sector. How do we make that work to our best advantage? I'll start with you, General, since you made the point, and then ask Sarah.
Yeah, I think, so having had the advantage of being like 1 year ago, literally on the other side of the fence, and I've only been retired from the Army now since last October for 10 months. And so understanding that relationship requires you to kind of cultivate the relationship a little bit better if you're on the government side with respect to making sure you understand why and what the private sector can actually do for you. In my mind, as I sat as the Chief Information Officer of the Army, what I saw from the private sector and what I really needed from them and what I tried to get going and cultivate, especially with the relationship, the two-way relationship, was the art of the possible. The private sector has the ability to show the government the way when it comes to the art of the possible. Where we start to run into challenges, I can't tell you how many trade shows that I've attended, and I can't tell you how many trade shows I've attended where I saw exactly the technology I needed. The real fun happened when I was looking to try and integrate that technology that I was seeing onto whatever platform it was that I needed the technology. And so I think the big thing, the experimentation and demonstration that's occurring in all of the services and military departments is heartening. But I think it's going to be that kind of thing, putting operators and developers as closely as you possibly can, as often as you possibly can, is going to be the game-changing thing that comes out of all of this with respect to the relationship between the government and the private sector. And so I just offer that as a couple of thoughts.
Thank you. Sarah?
I completely agree. And again, this is an area where I think Army has done a phenomenal job in looking at not only how do you kind of left seat, right seat operators and technology people, but then in their acquisition programs, doing things like fly-offs. Like, look, you want a new radar? That's great. We've got 7 people who think that they can develop this radar. Let's take them out to Wismar, and let's fly it off against some threats, and let's see which one actually performs best. And then making an informed acquisition decision after that. And it's harder to do with some other platforms, right? I mean, it's going to be harder to do, with all-up aircraft or all-up ships. But when you're, identifying those areas where U.S. technology, where technology really can help the operators, letting the operators iterate with those technologists frequently, and then choosing those best in breed and pulling them through the system is something that needs to happen, right? Because there's a lot, especially in the space world, where it's like if you have a CAD drawing and 2 guys in a clean room, man, you're gonna get through your Series A funding pretty quickly, and you'll all be multimillionaires here pretty soon. But at the end of the day, it's about, how does that technology that you're bringing transition over to an actual program of record so that it can get in the hands of a soldier, sailor, Marine, or Guardian to actually provide capability. And it's that transition that, quite frankly, is studied to death. I mean, it's literally called the Valley of Death, right? Where you have this amazing technology, the operators want it, and they just can't get it through the acquisition system. And the Department of Defense has really been doing a lot over the past couple of years to try to bridge that Valley of Death. You see it in the Air Force and AFWorks and SpaceWorks, in the strategic financing rounds. You see it in DIU. Those kinds of kind of creative approaches to acquisition, I think, really help the sector, the defense sector, figure out how to get in front of customers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, so incentive. As we build out policy for what we just described to happen, especially between the private sector and public sector and those partnerships, what we've really got to think about is, so where's the happy medium? What are the incentives going to be, and how are we going to incentivize via policy both sides to work together?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds like, it might sound more like mom and apple pie, and I saw someone in the crowd going money. All right, that seems to work. I think that's a part of it, because listen, if you're in the private sector, obviously you run a business, especially a lot of our smaller businesses. So I'm concerned about the public-private partnerships with the largest, but I'm also concerned about the smalls who don't have the infrastructure. They don't have as much capacity as some of the larges are to make some of this happen. And so I just thought that I'd offer the incentive piece is always an easy button to hit and talk about, but doing it extremely complicated.
There's a song, I'm going to age myself now, but it's called Peace, Prosperity, and a Little Bit of Paper by A Tribe Called Quest. Y'all are too young for A Tribe Called Quest, but there's a couple out there that I know will appreciate this. And, that's exactly right, is, creating incentives, making a framework. I tell people, frequently, they're like, but industry just wants to make money. And I'm like, well, yes, industry wants to make money. We live in a capitalist society. If you want a society where business is not interested in making money, you can look at our strategic competitors and see how they're faring.
Yes.
Right? I mean, let's just be real. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make a profit. It is not mutually exclusive from wanting to serve in the best capacity you can.
Yes, absolutely.
I will just add that, I mean, my experience in the intelligence community, I saw people, intelligence officers and also in the military, dealing with counterparts in the private sector who were making multiples of their income. They served for the reasons that you serve, looking at the middies in front of me here, that there's a patriotism. Fortunately, after you get your service, and even after it's 34 years, sometimes the private sector is smart enough to call upon you to come and contribute, but there is that tension. Luke, are you fixing to give me the hook? We got another question? Time for one more?
I think we're wrapping in a couple of minutes, if that's all right, sir.
When do we get a student question?
Yes. Student question, please.
We'll go into a little overtime. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. My question is for General Crawford. At the beginning of the panel, you talked about not only the need to innovate, but to integrate those innovations. As a self-proclaimed policy nerd married to an Army cyber officer, I've seen some integration challenges between the policy world and those who are helping to set those authorities for the use of cyber technologies, and the more technical cyber officers that are employing them. Mm-hmm. How do you think that we can address that integration gap, as well as the integration gap between the maneuver officers who now have these cyber technologies at their disposal, but often don't know how to use or how to employ them?
Yeah, the policy piece is fascinating, actually, but it's not new. All right, I remember listening to General Keith Alexander 10 years ago talk about authorities. And I think you started the conversation going down the path of authorities that are required. And the analogy he used, he said, listen, I live in the state of Maryland here with my command. If my installation gets attacked, I can act. If the state of Maryland gets attacked, I can't. And even if I can help them, I can't see because of what they can see because of some of the information sharing policy gaps. And so I think we'll have to, if we want to raise the resiliency level of the entire ecosystem, as I said before, that's kind of one. That's just a very small and simple example of some of the policy challenges that the average American doesn't know about. The other problem you talked about, now you're talking down at the maneuver unit, and it doesn't matter whether you're on a ship or you're flying a plane, now you're integrating capability that the user needs to kind of better understand. The good news is that the user of today is a lot smarter than the user of, let's say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, in terms of their digital literacy. They're not afraid of it. All right, and they really want to they want to test fire it. They want to push the envelope with the capability that you're giving them from a site. In this particular case, whether it's cyber or space. So you got a much more educated user. I won't say it's policy, but I'd say tactics, techniques, and procedures down at that level. I think they've evolved to the point to where your average combat, whether it's a pilot, you're a ground pounder, or you're driving a ship, they actually feel pretty good about being able to integrate and welcome that cyber or space warrior, I think, into their team. Not because they want to, but because they've acknowledged they need them in a multi-domain fight. So we're not there. And I don't want to be an old guy up here espousing that the problem doesn't exist. I've got a young captain in my family who's the son of my wife. So I'm pretty close to this one. I think you've uncovered something that's very, very important. But I think when you look what the schools are doing, they're literally forcing that integration to happen by educating the warfighter who's going to be using the capability.
Sarah, did you have anything to add on to that?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good there.
I think we're ready to wrap it up. I would just note, General, that part of this policy ramification is not only deterrence, but response and recovery. And we have representation here today, the outstanding Connecticut National Guard. And one of the reasons that they follow this very closely is because should there be a compromise, the ramifications of dealing with it fall to the states, which is another reason why I am very pleased with the work that the World Affairs Council does. This is not just national and international, it's local. And
absolutely.
it's, thank you for bringing it all together. Everybody, I think we've had two terrific panelists here. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you both very much.